Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for convening this important hearing and inviting me to testify. I will address Egypt's alarming repression and human rights fiasco, why this matters to the United States, and how we should respond. 7 years ago, then Defense Minister, now President, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, led the armed forces removal of unpopular but freely elected President Mohamed Morsi, promising civilian rule and a democratic transition. Instead, el-Sisi violently crushed opposition and built a military-backed dictatorship, the most repressive in Egypt's modern history. Today, the country has become, for many Egyptians, a dark and terrifying place. The regime says an iron grip is necessary to combat terrorism, but the crackdown far exceeds any legitimate security response, and the regime uses fighting terrorism as a cover for repression. The Sisi's laws deny fundamental freedoms. They enable a growing list of peaceful activities to be deemed terrorism, subject to draconian punishments. Institutions like the judiciary and the parliament have been purged of all but regime supporters. Independent civic activism is not tolerated. The Sisi governs with apparent disdain for civilians, as he increasingly empowers military colleagues to run the state and the economy, as Dr. Dunne described in her testimony. The human rights crisis under el-Sisi is dramatically worse than Mubarak's in scale, scope, and viciousness. First, scale. Several tens of thousands of Egyptians have been arrested on political grounds. Untold thousands are kept in a horrifying network of jails, prisons, and secret detention centers. Second, the wide scope of those affected. Caught up in this dragnet are not only Islamists, there are also secular politicians and youth activists, human rights defenders, women's rights advocates, children, journalists, LGBTQ Egyptians, Christian teenagers, Coptic rights activists, novelists and singers, senior military figures, and civilian residents of war-torn northern Sinai Peninsula. Scores of activists and intellectuals have fled Egypt, fearing for their lives. The many people who have been unjustly locked up include American citizens. In January, one of them, Mustafa Qasim, died in prison. Third is the viciousness of this regime's tactics, which include arrests of family members, forced disappearances, essentially state kidnapping, extrajudicial killings, sham trials, mass death sentences, and widespread torture and other abuse. Recently, challenged by the coronavirus and a sinking economy, the regime has ratcheted up repression even further. Doctors have been imprisoned for criticizing the government's pandemic response. And outrageously, the regime is retaliating against witnesses who bravely came forward to testify about a gang rape. Several witnesses, including an American citizen, were detained for morality crimes, and some were subject to intrusive sexual exams in custody. The United States has important strategic interests in Egypt, but they do not justify looking away from this human rights disaster. Indeed, we are implicated in it through our support for this regime. Not only is this situation morally abhorrent, it has directly harmed American citizens. What's more, el-Sisi's repression threatens Egypt's very stability. As we have seen before in this region, a combination of harsh authoritarian rule, deteriorating economy, and a large disaffected youth population can be highly combustible. Obviously, the United States cannot turn Egypt into a democracy that fully respects the rights of its citizens. Our influence is limited. Egypt's future lies mainly in the hands of Egyptians. But we must not conduct business as usual. At a minimum, some red lines must be drawn. First, the United States should consistently speak out against human rights violations. Second, President el-Sisi should not be invited to Washington while his regime is carrying out such horrific abuses. Third, Congress should reduce military aid, condition a portion of the remaining funds on human rights improvements with no security waiver. At the same time, we should do whatever we can to support those Egyptians who, against all odds, are bravely speaking out about human rights violations in fighting for justice and basic dignity.